welcome to Sunday in the House. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, on this March the 30th, 2025. It is the 13th week that we have been on the air with this broadcast. I started the first Sunday of this new year, this 30-minute broadcast, which I describe often with saying yes to Jesus and no to Trump. But today is also my birthday. 75 years I've made it. And 75 is a good year. It's a good age. It's great to be alive. I have friends along the way who did not make it to 75. And I want to send out a notice and a greeting and a memory to two of them especially. In my middle school years, although we didn't call it that back in the 60s, Leah Workman was a very, very close friend of mine in Murray, Kentucky. She died a few years ago. I miss her. She was very important to me in my early school years. And then I graduated from high school in St. Louis, Missouri, Hazelwood High School. One of my very closest friends was Pat Reeder Perkins, a lawyer in Missouri, longtime friend. She died a few years ago, and I might say that more than 100 of my classmates at Hazelwood High School did not make it to 75. So I'm glad to be here. I give thanks to God. I hope you are alive and well and that you make it to 75. It's a good time of life, and we've had a good time celebrating. Last night we had a big party. My happy birthday card right here came from friends and Sunday morning watchers up in New Hampshire. Thank you for that. Many of the gifts behind me as people celebrated with us here last night in this very room. We had a wonderful time. It's great to be alive and great to be 75, and I'm beginning my 76th year, and if God gives me strength and grace and vision, I'll stay at this Sunday in the House every Sunday morning for the coming year. I do want to say that it's been a good week for donors. We had 9 gifts this week, including 4 from new donors. You remember my goal has been to secure 75 donors in honor of my 75th birthday. A gimmick, I guess, to help raise money to support this program. But we're up to through 58 and waiting on the next gift, which will be donor number 59. That could be you. You can give online at themeetinghouse.net. You can send us a check the old-fashioned way. Somebody even brought cash last night. It was all good. It's all spendable. But the address is on the website at themeetinghouse.net/support, and you can read all about that. The money that you send us supports this broadcast clearly, and also the weekly newsletter. If you are not subscribed to that, you can subscribe and read it. It comes out every Thursday. And then this September, I am scheduled to do Tangle Tour 25, and I'm going to take this show, Sunday in the House, and broadcast it from Washington, D.C. on the first Sunday in September, from New York City on the second Sunday of September, from New Hampshire with the people who sent me the card, the third Sunday of September, and then in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on the fourth Sunday in September. And your donations will help offset the cost of that travel as well. Thank you for joining today, and I encourage you to share this on your Facebook page. We broadcast every Sunday live on Facebook, but beginning today, we're also broadcasting on YouTube, and you can watch us on YouTube. Now, every Sunday, I try to have a red letter lesson where we take a look at the life and teaching of Jesus. And I do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, Jesus, of course, his life, his teachings, his death, his resurrection, are the central elements of our faith. And so, again and again, we go back to it. But here, there's another reason. And that's because the version of Christianity that has taken over the country, what we call Christian Nationalism, or sometimes we call it MAGA Christianity, avoids the life and teaching of Jesus. When you listen to them preach, when you read their books like I have, when you listen to their justification for their agenda, they rarely, if ever, mention Jesus. They'll quote Moses, they'll quote Paul the Apostle, they'll quote some of the prophets in the Old Testament, but they avoid Jesus. The reason for this, of course, is that very little of what Jesus did and said supports the agenda of MAGA Christianity. And one of the reasons that I launched this broadcast and actually resigned the church where I was preaching and pastoring was to speak directly and forcefully and consistently to this issue. One of my missions is to interpret the religion in the United States from the perspective of what Jesus said and taught. And I want to go back to a text that I have mentioned for the last couple of weeks. It's one of the more popular texts about Jesus, and I want to refer to it. I brought my red letter Bible. Maybe you have a red letter Bible where the words of Jesus are in red. I used to think this was somewhat silly in my younger days. This little New Testament, which I have, brown leather, I inherited from my father, Tom Moody, who was also a Bible teacher. When he died, he left me much of his papers and his books, and I've got them stored away and stashed away. But this little red letter Bible, which I inherited from my dad, Tom Moody, I want to come back to the second of Jesus' long sermons. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus had two sermons. One is the Sermon on the Mount, occupies chapters 5, 6, and 7, 3 chapters, begins with the Beatitudes we're very familiar with. Right in the middle of it is the prayer that he gave us to pray, what we call the prayer of Jesus or the Our Father. It ends with the famous story that we learned in Bible school. I did. The story about the wise man who built his house upon a rock. And the rains came down and the floods came up, but the house on the rock stood firm. It's a great little song. It's a great parable that Jesus told. That's the Sermon on the Mount. Very important stuff in that sermon, and it justifies us again and again going back to the Sermon on the Mount. But at the end of Matthew's Gospel, 28 chapters, there is another sermon, 2 chapters, chapter 24 and 25. Now, both of these, what we call sermons, are really a collection of Jesus' teaching that he must have repeated many times, many places, in many settings, for a number of purposes, different audiences. And his followers, the first gospel teachers and preachers, gathered up this material, packaged it in these sermon forms or in these collected forms. And this is certainly true of this second sermon, chapters 24 and 25. We actually have a different version of this sermon in Mark chapter 13. And it's interesting to compare these two versions of this one sermon, sometimes called Jesus' prophetic sermon, because he talks about the future. And I want to read a little bit from it. You remember the sermon opens up with the disciples pointing out the architecture of the great temple that had been built by Herod. It's still today a fascinating, impressive sight. And some of the stones that Herod put in place are still there. And if you've been to Israel, been to Jerusalem, like I have many times, you can go put your hands on these stones, very stones in many cases that Jesus himself would have touched as he came in and out of the temple. So on this particular day, the disciples pointed to this magnificent building and said, "Wow, this is a great building, isn't it, Jesus?" Jesus, not so much impressed by the architecture, he took the occasion to say something about the future of the temple. And he said to his disciples, "You see these stones, this great temple, this structure, Temple Mount we call it now, it's all going to be destroyed. It's all going to be torn down." He said, "Not one stone left upon another." Of course, that's kind of an exaggeration, because there are stones that are still left on top of another that were standing at that time. But what he was trying to say was that this massive, beautiful, impressive building was going to be destroyed because trouble was coming. I talked about this last week. Jesus was warning his people that political trouble was coming. Now, you can see immediately how important this warning is to us today. Not only those of us in the United States dealing with political trouble, but people around the world where countries are even less stable than ours, where countries are at war, trying to survive. We think of what's going on in Gaza. We think of what's going on in Ukraine. We think of the disarray in a number of countries, continents around the world. Jesus was alert to the political realities of his own day. This is an important thing that we need to remind ourselves. Jesus shaped his teaching by the political realities of his day. As a matter of fact, we can track the whole life of Jesus in this way. If you remember how the life of Jesus began, the very first sentence, according to Luke, was that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because of a political action, that is, the census that the Romans demanded of all the people in the Roman Empire. That is, his birth itself, the place of it, was shaped and determined by a political act, what we now call an executive action, that have become popular in our own country. And then, when he was an infant, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, at least that number, maybe other people, had to flee. That is, they became refugees. One of the great realities of the world, every century, all the time, is people on the move. Sometimes it's migration, people seeking a better place to live, a safer place to live. And sometimes it's refugees fleeing violence, danger, oppression, and poverty. We see this going on in the world all the time right now. As a matter of fact, I'm in the early stages of reading a book about all of this. There is a young scholar at Emory University from Senegal who has spent his career writing about migration, in particular about the African migration, not just in the recent years, but all the way back through history. This book, Beyond Christendom, get my glasses here, Globalization, African Migration, and the Transformation of the West. I'll have it reviewed. It's a very dense book. He has an easier book that came out about 10 years ago, specifically about how migration has shaped the Christian church. I'm going to read that next. I will write a commentary and put it on the website and in the newsletter. So those of you who get the newsletter, you can read that commentary. But the point I'm trying to make is that migration has been it's a political act, often forced by the political acts of people in power, and that's what we see around the world today. We as a country have forced people in our own country to migrate. We think, of course, of the great migration of African people from Africa to the United States where they were enslaved. We think of the Indians, Native Americans. The Cherokee once lived all around us here in South Carolina. And one of our presidents, Andrew Jackson, issued a presidential decree, signed one of those documents, and forced these Native Americans to relocate out to primarily Oklahoma. We call it the Trail of Tears because it was an awful thing. It was an ungodly thing. It's the kind of thing that this current president doesn't want described in the Smithsonian Institution, but I digress. So here, I watched a video yesterday. Some of you are on TikTok, and not only was yesterday a party celebrating my birthday, but I crossed the threshold of 2,000 followers on TikTok yesterday, 2001 by this morning. I listened to a woman on TikTok yesterday in Great Britain bemoan the immigration of Muslims into Great Britain. And she went through a whole list of cities that have Muslim mayors. The Muslim population of Great Britain is 4 million people, roughly 6% of the population, and yet they've been elected mayor in 10 or 12 of the towns over there. She called it, at the end of her video, not a migration, but an invasion. Sounds like our own president and his people here. Afraid of people of color, afraid of people who are different, afraid that our own culture cannot withstand the integration of people who are different. Now, we've been through this many times with Jews, with Catholics, with foreigners. There's always been this native element that's pushed back against all of this immigration. But I bring this story up because Jesus himself and his family were migrants. They were refugees looking for a safe place to live. And they were in Egypt. And then I'm going to read this text for you from Matthew. This is the second chapter of Matthew. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. So you see the combination of political events, public political events, and personal instinct, saying, "Arise, take this young child and his mother," referring to Jesus, "go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life." Refugees are always relieved when the danger at home is over. They always want to go back. This is true all over the world. Refugees don't want to stay in a foreign country. They want to go back to their own country, now as well as then. Verse 21, so Joseph arose, took the young child and his mother, and came to the land of Israel. They had to go right through Gaza on a road called the Via Maris, the way of the sea. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus reigned in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. So here he was paying attention again to the political realities in which he had to live. He decided not to go back where he wanted to go, which was Jerusalem and the hill country. He decided not to do that because of who was in charge. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside to the parts of Galilee. That is, when he got to what would be modern-day Tel Aviv, which was not even a city then, instead of turning to the east and going up the hill country into Jerusalem, he continued north past what later became Caesarea through the great pass of Megiddo into the Jezreel Valley and back up into Galilee. He did it because of the political realities of who was in charge of each of these areas. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, and that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now it's interesting because in the prophets, a Nazarene was not necessarily somebody from a town called Nazareth, but it was a certain discipline of living, a certain community, a religious community that had certain rules about what to eat, what to drink, how to live, how to dress, and all of that. But they connected this, of course, his political-driven decision, they connected it with their Old Testament, their Hebrew scriptures, and that is, of course, what we do all the time. It's exactly what I'm doing here this morning, trying to connect our situation to what we read in our own sacred text. Now, what I want to say is that as we read the life of Jesus, what I call a red letter lesson, we hope it generates what I call from time to time a red letter revival. Now, one of my listeners on Sunday morning wrote me and said, don't use that word revival. That's an old-fashioned word. Young people and contemporary people and quasi-religious people won't even know what it is, what a revival is. Of course, in a specific sense, a revival is a series of worship services where evangelists try to present Christ in a way that people will respond. But in a broader sense, we use the word revival like we use the word a renaissance or a renewal or an awakening or maybe even a trend. We use it in culture, we use it in music, we use it in fashion, the revival. Right now we're in a revival, just as an aside, of men's fashion. I've noticed again and again where men are now wearing sport jackets with very, very wide lapels. I don't know whether I can do that. We did it once. Who knows? What's next? Maybe bell bottoms. We used to wear those too. But a revival, what we need is a renewal, a renaissance, a reawakening of the life and teaching of Jesus to counter this MAGA religion that has endorsed President Trump and all the ugliness that has spewed out of Washington, D.C. Not only ugly language, ugly attitudes, ugly disposition, a certain kind of meanness that all of his people, it's as if he did not choose the people who were most capable. He chose the people who had a kind of a mean streak in them, who look at all of us as enemies and to be conquered and to be ridiculed and rejected. Over and over and over again, this happens. This is ungodly. This is not consistent with the teaching of Jesus. This is why they cannot quote Jesus. This is why they cannot refer to Jesus. You watch this. You follow along. Listen to their sermons. They use a lot of religious language, but very little of Jesus. So I think we need to be alert politically to what's going on around us. We need to be shrewd. I got a phone call last night from one of my former students, a young preacher maybe half my age, distraught. Talked to me a long time about how discouraged he was over his ability, his role as a preacher to counter the ugliness that his people experience where they are. This is something that all of us are struggling with today. How can we continue to be faithful followers of Jesus and at the same time do so realistically in the political environment in which we find ourselves? Now, you've heard me say over and over again that there are 5 things that we need to do. We need to march. We need to boycott. We need to strike. Now, we haven't started striking yet, but it's coming. We need to vote. There's some small voting going on around the country now. And we need to pray. Now, behind me, over here, is the first protest poster I have ever made in my life. And I want to tell you how this came about. I watched a TikTok video, an 83-year-old woman talk about these very things. And she said this. She said, the salvation of our country. Now, she wasn't a religious person as far as I know. She didn't talk religion in this video. But she said, the salvation of our country depends upon us. She literally said, us old women. That's what she said. It depends on us, taken to the streets. And she began to talk about where she was. She never said where she was, but she said, I've picked out a street corner in my town. I've made a poster, and I'm going to take a stand and see what happens. I was so inspired by her TikTok testimony that I made this poster back here. Less Trump and more Jesus. I was in the space here this morning it was last night putting everything up, and one of the residents here at our apartment, he came in and said to me as I was putting it up, he said, well, yes, more Jesus. I can go with that, but I'm not sure about the less Trump. Well, for me, it's less Trump. The other side of my poster says, no to Musk, yes to Jesus. Because I have a corner in my town where somebody's going to see me this week holding my poster up for whoever is around. Maybe you need a place like this. We're going to have to do this to counter the ungodly, unjust, immoral, anti-Christian arrest of people who are legitimately here doing good things. We've all seen the video this week of the woman who was arrested outside of her apartment. I think it is the most ungodly thing that I've seen in these 2 months. A PhD student from Turkey studying in Boston on her way to break the Ramadan fast this week, suddenly surrounded by 6 men dressed in black. When did you ever see that in America? Their faces covered in masks. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like exactly what happened to Jesus. They came at night so they could do it undercover. They surrounded Jesus, who himself was not a threat to anybody. They arrested him and carted him off. And I'm telling you, what happened on the streets of Boston this week parallels that exactly. And Jesus is with these immigrants, these students, these refugees, wherever they are. Jesus travels with the refugees. As we look around our political environment, I want to encourage you to be strong, to stand up, to push back, to speak your voice. We have to work together in the Spirit of Jesus, inspired by the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, all the while being kind to one another, continuing our ministry just like Jesus did, right to the very end. Thank you for joining me this morning for Sunday in the House. This is week number 13. Take this and share it to your friends on Facebook. Tell somebody else about it. Send me a message. Ask me a question. Send me a birthday card if you want. God bless all of you, especially those of you who have birthdays this week. Thank you for joining. Have a great weekend. God bless you all, and I will see you next week, next Sunday in the house.